All right, hello everybody, and welcome to day 3 of Sequestration Week. Today we're going to be talking about grasslands as carbon sinks and the role that grasslands and cows have in helping us to hit our climate targets. We have 3 amazing presenters today that we'll introduce in just a moment. My name is Brian Stewart from Electrify Now, and my colleague Joe Nutritionist from Electrify Now will be moderating today. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I want to just give a little background on Electrify Now so you know who we are. We're a voluntary organization. We work with homeowners primarily to help educate and motivate people and empower people to take actions to create the clean energy future that all of us want and need. We talk about 3 actions that you can take in your own lives, which has to do with cleaning up your electric supply, so getting renewable energy to your home. It's very easy to do and affordable. Then casting your eye out and looking at all those devices you have in your home that burn fossil fuels and finding an electric replacement for every one of them, because those exist. In fact, they perform better than their gas burning counterparts and can save tons of emissions. And then finally, electrifying your transportation. There's great EV options that are on the market now and more to come. And then we also know that while it's important for us to take these voluntary actions, there are some people who will struggle to take those actions. So it's important that we help everyone to be part of this transition. We call that Electrify Everyone, by using our voice to help shape policy and our donations to help bring low-income families and our underserved communities along with us in this transition. So all of us, most of the typical household can avoid 20 tons of CO2 per year by taking these actions and won't really make any compromise to your way of living. You can find out more about this on our website. There's tons of tips, resources, even discounts from contractors, etc. electrifynow.net. I want to give a huge thank you to everyone who has made a donation. We ask for that as part of voluntary donations to just help local charities. In this case, we're working with Friends of Trees, who's planting trees in Oregon and mostly here in the Portland area. I also want to so thank you for those donations. I also want to give a huge thank you to PAE Engineering, who has helped sponsor today's webinar. All right, Joe, so why are we talking about carbon sequestration?
Right, so hopefully a lot of you have been able to catch our first 2 sequestration webinars. We're devoting an entire week to talking about sequestration, and normally we are talking about how to reduce emissions. And like Brian said, it's through electrification and using renewable energy. But we know that we have to also sequester carbon, take carbon out of the atmosphere if we're going to keep our climate livable. So we want to talk about a lot of topics around sequestration. And on Monday, we talked about engineered carbon sequestration, carbon capture and storage. Yesterday, we talked about forests and natural carbon sequestration. And today, we're going to talk on grasslands as carbon sinks and the role of ruminants or cows in this process. We'll introduce our panelists in a second. A quick plug for our next 2 webinars. We have green concrete tomorrow and then soils on Friday. I'll put all the links in the chat for you all. And I just did want to say we've had a lot of interest. Over 2,000 people have registered for this entire week of webinars from over 41 countries. So you've seen people already put it in the chat, but if you feel comfortable sharing where you're calling in from tonight or today, go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'd love to hear from where people are tuning in from. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Brian.
All right, I'm just going to do a brief introduction of our panelists today. 3 really experts on this topic who are going to help us to unpack this and learn more. We're going to start out with Justin Stenkamp from PAE, and he's a associate principal there. He's a mechanical engineer with almost 2 decades of experience designing a bunch of different kinds of buildings, primarily LEED certified and living buildings. He's done several net zero and energy water projects. He's here because he's got a keen interest in how nature and ecosystems can inform design, and he's been on this kind of 10-year adventure of learning and applying permaculture design principles to his work, but partly through running his own small rotational-based woodlot pork hobby farm. So he's going to give us a little introduction to the topic, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Frank Mitloehner from the Clear Center at University of California at Davis. And the Clear Center is dedicated to studying animal agriculture and the environment to help us all understand how animals impacted environment and human impact and human health. And he has a PhD from Texas Tech in animal science and is professor of air quality at Clear. He's conducted research in the areas of air quality, environmental physiology, and ethology, and he's super passionate about understanding and mitigating emissions from livestock operations and helping to meet the global food production challenges that we'll face as the population continues to expand. Then we'll be hearing from Diana Rodgers. She's a writer and nutritionist. She has been living on an organic farm. She is a licensed registered dietitian nutritionist, and she has been helping people with weight issues, metabolic issues, and intestinal issues to recover their health through diet and lifestyle. She's the host of the Sustainable Dish podcast, and she speaks regularly at conferences internationally about nutrition, sustainability, social justice, animal welfare, and food policy issues. Excitingly, and one of the reasons why we know about her and why she's here today is because she just released a new book and documentary called Sacred Cow, which I would highly recommend that you check out. We'll put information about that on the chat. But this book and documentary explores the important role of animals in our food system. So we're really fortunate to have these three experienced people with us today. I'm going to turn it over to Justin to get us started, but thank you in advance to our panelists for helping us out with this.
Thank you for the introduction. I wanted to start off with one of my favorite quotes from a permaculturalist, Tony Hemingway. To be sustainable, our culture must function as a mature ecosystem. I think what really captures my attention from this is that I think it gives us an endpoint of what we're trying to accomplish, whether it's electrifying our transportation, electrifying our buildings, electrifying our electrical grid, so moving away from gas or electrifying everyone. We're trying to function as much of an ecosystem, like an ecosystem as possible. And the how, I'm also very interested in. Toby was a designer, an author, and a teacher of permaculture. And for those that don't know, permaculture is a design methodology that mimics the patterns of functional ecology to create systems of support for humanity that are mutually beneficial with ecology. And I think that that's a really fascinating way to look at things, and I have a personal interest in it. And this idea of using ecosystems to mimic how we create other things, whether it's leadership or even food. So a question that follows is, can we create a food system that mimics ecosystems? And I'm going to give a really, really brief overview of two farmers that are relatively well known in the permaculture community, just as a way to kind of frame options and for people to go and do more research and look into people that are doing this work. And Frank and Diana will get into a little bit more on the science, but when we look at some of the ecosystems, at least in North America, can we take inspiration from those? And one of those ecosystems would be the North American prairie. And real simply, how a mechanical engineer would explain how the system works is it's based on, it's a grassland. And there's this relationship between the predators, the wolves in this case, the bison and the grass that's mutually beneficial. The bison, the grass goes through its process of photosynthesis, grows, the bison eat it, and the wolves move the bison around. And this functionality is developed where it keeps the bison in tight herds, small areas, and they're moving. So they're not just the way it works. They're not overgrazing the grasslands. And then the birds come through and pick through the droppings and also help contribute it. But it makes for an ecology that over time had built feet of topsoil in North America. And thankfully there's somebody lots of people now actually that are mimicking that. And one famous farmer, Joel Salatin, there's lots of names for this: holistic grazing, mob grazing, managed grazing. I like the way Joel Salatin describes it: mob stocking, herbivorous, solar conversion, lignified carbon sequestration, fertilization. He's kind of a poet farmer, but he modeled his farm based on this. He replaced the wolves with electric fence, the bison with cattle, and the birds with chickens, and he rotates all of them around his farm. And if you listen to the stories and listen to him talk, he talks about the soil that's been built over time and how it's created this thriving ecology and also this thriving economic ecology, where he's even producing new farmers that are going out and doing this innovative work. Another place we could look for inspiration would be from savannas. If you're in the AEC industry like I am, you've probably been to charrettes where you talk about biophilia, and savannas are one of the things that we talk about often there because of the views and just our fascination with them and the views and our through our own evolutionary history. And there's another farmer, Mark Shepard, runs New Forest Farm. It's in the Midwest. And he modeled his farm after a savanna. And you can tell this is kind of in corn and soy country, and it looks much different than the surrounding farms. So what Mark had done was he used a design methodology called keyline design, where basically he uses the contour of the land to manage the water on the site. And the way that works, water flows 90 degrees to the contour, and you can move that and soak the water in. Then he planted chestnuts, so a perennial tree, a blight resistant chestnut on contour. And then he had the alleys in between, and he calls it alley cropping. I've heard it referred to as tree intercropping and things like that. But he was able to create a system that in 30 years has a perennial plant that produces fat, carbohydrates, and protein in the form of chestnuts. And while that system was maturing, he was alley cropping. So he's selling into Organic Valley. He was raising cattle in the alleyways, and also pork. And really fascinating. His stuff is really good to work at. He also runs a company called Restoration Agriculture, but two good people to look into. Now, I have a personal bias towards permaculture, and also really fascinated with this idea of good meat. So I will admit that up front, but this was also addressed in the book Drawdown, which is a very popular book talking about reduction of greenhouse gases and including carbon sequestration. And two of the top 20 strategies in that book, I just talked about managed grazing and silvopasture in that book, strategies for that, primarily because of they're modeled on functional ecosystems. And this is just a quick snapshot of information from that book and the different strategies that Mark and Joel are using on their farm. This doesn't include tree intercropping, which is also in Drawdown. So those are two examples. And ultimately what we're trying to do, like I said earlier, is model these functional ecologies and restore a functional carbon cycle. So I want to just close out with that. I'll turn it over to Frank to get into the specifics of some of that. But I wanted to just close out with two quotes. One from Joel, basically saying that we have a privilege and a responsibility to participate in this, to make the world better for our children. When people ask what you can do to make things better on the food front, I think my most simplistic answer is to shake hands with the person that produces your food. And then I'll turn it over with this quote that's had my attention lately. The quality of our lives and the lives of our children are dependent on the quality of our questions and being open to new ideas and trying to understand what we can learn from people like Frank and Diana. And I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Justin. While you're transitioning there, just a little note on the Drawdown book. You know, that book is amazing because it just captures so many different solutions. And interestingly, you know, if you add together things that are oftentimes combined, and you showed a few on your slide there, those things add up. If you add them up, it puts those solutions to, I believe it's number 8 in terms of the most powerful potential way for us to reduce carbon. So a lot of these things are listed separately in that book, but are often combined in some of the systems that are possible to create. So it's a great reference.
All right, should I just get going?
Yes.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I was asked to talk about greenhouse gases and particularly methane. And I think that we have significant opportunities in and around agriculture along those lines. Next slide, please. So I'm on Twitter. My handle is GHGGuru. Next slide. Having a lot of fun on Twitter, by the way. What you see here is a slide from our World in Data, and it compares different food groups. And you oftentimes find that, namely that people compare different food groups based on their carbon footprint. But then if you look at the x-axis, it says greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food product. I cannot wrap my mind around why people would compare a pound or kilo of beef to pound or kilo of bananas or tomatoes or apples. I mean, obviously we are comparing something that is so nutritionally different. It's really a fallacy. But what's even more important here is that everything that you see under the top one, the beef one, that's in brown, or the vast majority of that is hinged around methane. And methane is what I will talk about during this talk. But what is also really important when considering these kind of graphs is that they're always global. They're global graphs and very, very different with respect to their greenhouse gas intensity from what we do in a country like the United States. Very different. In this case, 4 times higher than what we achieve here in the United States. Next slide. Next slide. So methane is very different from other greenhouse gases. Why? Because other greenhouse gases are just produced. But methane is not just produced, methane is also destroyed. If you look at this slide, you see on the left side various sources: fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste, biomass burning, and so on. And these different sources produce 560 teragrams of methane. You see that in the first half bubble. And this is where most reporters and so on end the story, saying, you know, methane is a potent greenhouse gas. There are various sources, of which agriculture is a major one. Hence, we need to reduce it. And I agree, we do need to reduce it. But we also need to acknowledge this very important nuance of the story, namely that methane is not just produced, but as you can see on the right side, also destroyed. Total sinks of methane in the world amount to 550 teragrams. So 560 are produced and 550 are destroyed, leaving us with a total of 10 teragrams of methane we need to get rid of. And that's a sizable chunk, but it's certainly a very different number than just focusing on emissions alone. So as a take-home message on this one is, methane is different from other greenhouse gases insofar that it's not just produced, but also destroyed. And if you look on the right side, you see a large arrow pointing downward. And this arrow has a title underneath saying, sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. So what happens is that methane, a methane molecule in the atmosphere, within approximately a decade, finds what's called a radical, another molecule. And this radical destroys the methane. And that happens within 10 years. It does not happen to the other greenhouse gases, but it does happen to methane. And the reason why I tell you all of this is because methane is the 800-pound gorilla, the big deal in agriculture that we need to address, particularly in and around ruminant livestock. Next slide. So while it's very clear that methane is a potent greenhouse gas, it's about 28 times more potent than the CO2. It is also true that because it's not just produced, but also destroyed, its lifespan is so much shorter than that of CO2 or nitrous oxide. While the other gases are long-lived, methane is short-lived because it finds its destroyer, so to say, the so-called radical within a decade. It only has a short lifespan in the atmosphere. Next slide. If you ever wondered where the carbon in the methane, the CH4, where that carbon came from, it really originates in plants. Well, no, I should go further back. The plants, what do plants need to grow? Click. Now Joe will have to click a couple of times. So what do plants need to do, need to grow? They need sunlight, they need water, and they need a form of carbon, and that's atmospheric CO2. That's the source of that carbon. The plants then produce either cellulose or starch or both, the carbohydrates, and sooner or later a bovine comes along, eats some of that above ground material, and click, produces methane. The carbon in that methane is not new carbon added to the atmosphere, but it is recycled carbon. It is the same carbon that was in the atmosphere before in the form of CO2. So now, please listen very carefully. If you consider a constant cattle herd, then that constant cattle herd produces methane, but the equal amount of methane that's produced by that constant herd is also destroyed through this process called oxidation. That's done by these radicals, these so-called hydroxyl radicals. A constant herd produces methane, but the equal amount of methane that's produced is also being destroyed from constant herds. Constant herds do not add additional methane to the atmosphere. Constant herds do not add additional warming to our climate. Increasing methane does do a bad trick to our climate, okay? Because it's a potent greenhouse gas. But thank God we have a natural removal of methane, and that's, click, the so-called hydroxyl oxidation. This is a removal process done by these radicals that take the hydrogen away from the methane, convert it back into CO2. Now click. What you can see here is that the carbon is actually going through a cycle. It's either called the biological or the biogenic carbon cycle, where carbon goes from atmospheric CO2 into plant carbohydrates, into methane, and then back into CO2. Next slide. This is really different from carbon that's associated with fossil fuels. Fossil fuels being oil, coal, and gas, carbon that was stored in the ground for a very long time. Formerly forests and animals that died, decayed, fossilized. And over the last 70 years, humans managed to extract half of all that fossil fuel from the ground. We burned it. And by doing so, we added this carbon from the ground into the atmosphere. That is a one-way street and not a cycle. Next slide. And here some advertisement for my friend Diana Rodgers. This is straight from her book, Sacred Cow. On the left side, you see the fossil fuel carbon. That's that one-way street I was alluding to, where carbon was stored in the ground. It's unlocked and burned, adding ancient carbon to the atmosphere. Whereas on the right side, you see this biological carbon cycle, where you have, and I start here, atmospheric CO2. It goes during photosynthesis into plant material. Some of it stays above ground, that's the carbohydrates I talked about. Some of it goes below ground into the roots, and from the roots into the soil. Process referred to as soil carbon sequestration. That's really the topic of this conference. So through grazing, we are adding more, we are increasing the rate of soil carbon sequestration, particularly if we do grazing right. For example, if we do rotational grazing, we will accelerate the rate by which carbon is coming from the atmosphere into plant material and into the soil, where it's locked away unless we disturb those soils. If we now start tilling and plowing and so on, then we unleash that carbon again. But a proper grazing system does what I just said. So now the cow comes along and eats some of that above ground material. And then as a response to that, during enteric fermentation, he or she belches out methane, which resides in the atmosphere for 10 years, and then that becomes CO2 again. So this is really a cycle here, okay? What's really important is we do not want to increase methane, meaning growing herds, for example, over time, but we want to keep methane sources stable, or even better, find ways to reduce methane. If you reduce methane from the livestock system, something beautiful will result, as you will see in one of my next slides. Next slide, please. So this slide and the next few slides are a little bit technical, but it's really important to get this out and get this clear. So imagine you were to drive from home to work, day one, on Monday. You burn gas. By doing so, burning gas, you put CO2 into the atmosphere. On Tuesday, you drive the same distance. You put new additional CO2 into the atmosphere, which is now on top of what you put out on Monday. On Wednesday, you drive again, and you add new additional CO2 to the existing stock that you already added on Tuesday and Monday. Because of this fact that every time we burn fossil fuel, we're adding new additional CO2 to the existing stock. Because of that, CO2 is called a stock gas, okay? The trajectory of this is always up, 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 and up. Every time we burn fossil fuel, we add new CO2 to the atmosphere, and that leads to more additional warming. Click. It's not the same with methane. Methane is currently treated in the regulatory arena as if it were a stock gas, as if it were to accumulate in the atmosphere just like CO2 does. But methane does not accumulate in the atmosphere like CO2 does. Methane is both produced and destroyed, and I told you that before. Methane is not a stock gas, it's a flow gas. It stays stagnant because it is destroyed at the same rate it's emitted. I will give you a quick analogy, one that I love, okay? So imagine two bathtubs. The first bathtub is my CO2 bathtub analogy. Imagine you have a faucet, but no drain in that bathtub. You open the faucet, whether you turn it on just a little bit or full force, the water level will always rise because there's no drain, okay? That's the CO2 analogy bathtub. Now comes the methane bathtub. The methane bathtub has both a faucet and a drain. If you add a constant rate of water to that bathtub through the faucet, then with an open drain, the equivalent amount of water will run off, meaning the water level will stay stable. If you crank up the faucet all the way so that there's more water added than can drain off, then the level will go up. And we don't want to see that. By the way, in parts of the world, we do see that. Where livestock herds grow drastically in many developing countries, we see methane going up, despite the fact that it's a flow gas. In the developed world, we see a different scenario. We either see a scenario where the inflow, the amount of methane produced and the amount of methane destroyed are in balance. It's in most developed countries, or in some countries, in some regions, we now see the following, where the faucet is turned down and more water runs off than is replenished. And that means our levels go down. And that's what happens when you reduce methane gas. That's what happens when you reduce methane gas, namely that you induce something called negative warming. Next slide. I will lead you through three scenarios. That's really important. The first one is a scenario where methane increases by 35%. The second one, where methane is stable, roughly stable. And the third one, where methane is decreased by 35%. The way we currently quantify the impact of methane on greenhouse gases, click, is through a unit called GWP 100. That has been used for the last 30 years. Unfortunately, it's quite wrong. Why? Because it treats methane as if it were a stock gas. As you can see, the increasing, the stable, and the decreasing methane scenario are all depicted as if we were to have drastically increased CO2 equivalent units, meaning a lot of additional greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Now, the University of Oxford, several scientists there said, this is not right. This is not what really happens in physics and in atmospheric chemistry, because methane is not a stock gas, it's a flow gas. There is a removal, atmospheric removal, that this unit does not account for. So they proposed a new unit, click, called GWP star. And GWP star indeed finds the same as this old GWP 100 unit. When you increase methane, you add a lot of additional warming to the atmosphere. We do not want to see it, and I already told you, in parts of the world, we do see it. In the developed world, we do not see it. We see more of the second scenario, where livestock herds are pretty stable, in some cases even decreasing. And so as a result, you see at the center on the right side that there's no additional warming added to this graph. In fact, the blue area, which is the warming, is south of the x-axis. There's a little bit of negative warming. That's why the 10 has a negative sign in front of it. If we reduce methane strongly by 35%, then we see a strong reduction of warming. That is called negative warming, and negative warming is a fancy word for cooling. What I'm telling you here is that if you manage to strongly reduce methane by 10, 20, 30%, then we are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, much as if we were to, let's say, plant trees, which take CO2 out of the atmosphere, or much like what we see when we sequester a lot of carbon using our grazing strategies. Next slide. Can this be done? Can we have a strong reduction of greenhouse gases? Well, it can be done, and it has already been done. Here in California, some of the policies include methane reduction policies. We have the goal of reducing methane by 40%, and that's a law, 40% to be achieved by the year 2030. So that leaves us only a few more years. And our farmers at first thought they would go through the roof. But then the state decided to assist the farmers, financially incentivizing the reduction of greenhouse gases, particularly methane. Farmers went ahead and they covered their lagoon, like you see on this slide, trapping biogas that normally would go into the air. And this trapped biogas is then not burned to be made into power, but it's converted into renewable natural gas, which is a fuel type. And that RNG then goes into vehicles to fuel semi-trucks, for example. This conversion of biogas to fuel is very strongly financially incentivized by the state of California through what's called low carbon fuel standard credits. As a result, many of our particularly large dairies have already installed these covered lagoons and have achieved a 2.2 million metric ton reduction of methane per year. 2.2 million metric tons is nothing to sneeze at, okay? That's a very significant amount. Next slide. An amount that equates to a 25% reduction of methane that we have already achieved in California in the last 3 years. Again, we are supposed to achieve a total of 40%. We are over halfway there by doing what I just told you. In addition to covering lagoons, we are looking into finding ways to reduce enteric emissions from livestock through feed additives, and we find that some feed additives can reduce enteric methane by anywhere between 10 to 50%. This technology will be out there in the next 5 years or so, the technology of reducing greenhouse gases through feed additives. Next slide. There are some people who say, well, despite and on the side, let's not just focus on agricultural production, but also on what we eat. And they claim that we eat way too much animal protein. And so I had to include this slide here, which actually looks into what's called NHANES. This is a study, a major nutritional study that compared, for example, what is recommended versus what we actually eat in this country. In 2016, the USDA estimated that we do eat 5.8 ounces of meat and poultry per day. 5.8. The dietary guidelines recommends that we do eat 5.5 ounces. So that's slightly less than what we actually do eat. This graph I find busy on the one hand, but quite interesting. It shows on the left side male protein intake, and on the right side female protein intake. At the x-axis or on the x-axis, you see the age groups of the males, from little kids to seniors, and then in blue you see the recommended protein intake ranges, and the orange dots show the actual intake of each of those age groups. So you can see, if you look at all the age groups on the male and the female side, that most actual intakes are well within the recommended range, except for 3 male groups. On the female side, you see that females in this country actually consume protein at the lower end of what's recommended. The notion of we're eating way too much protein, we need to cut this in order to save the planet or save whatever else, is really not based on reliable data. Next slide. Can we eat our way out of climate change? Diana asked me to add that. There are some people who say we should change what we eat, we should become vegan, vegetarian or so in order to change our carbon impacts. Can we do so? Click. If we were to go vegan for 1 year, that 1 year vegan would save 0.8 tons of greenhouse gases, so-called CO2 equivalent gases. Click. Contrast that with 1 transatlantic flight per passenger, which amounts to 1.6 tons. So going vegan has half the impact as flying from the United States to Europe per passenger. Click. Going meatless Monday as an entire nation, the United States, would reduce greenhouse gases by 0.3%. Click. And the entire nation going vegan would reduce greenhouse gases by 2.6%. The authors of that study cautioned, though, if we were to attempt such a radical step, we would not be able to satisfy the nutritional needs of producing essential macro and micronutrients at the level we need. If you are interested in what the greatest environmental harm does to our environment, from the entire food system, then click next slide. You have to look at this. This is the average US family in front of the food waste associated with that family. We are wasting 40% of all food produced in the United States, not just in the United States, in the entire developed world, and even more surprising, even in developing countries. There it's called food loss, not food waste, because there the losses occur more at the farming level. People can harvest on time, transport to the market, distribute it, and so on. Whereas in the developed world, these food waste amounts of 40% occur more at the consumer level. Clearly, the 800-pound gorilla, in my opinion. So with that, I gave you a little overview over greenhouse gases and the change of narrative around methane, which is really major. The importance of sequestration should be clear. And also that a change of eating habits will not get us to where we need to go, at least not in the food sector, at least not in my opinion. So with that, I think that's my last slide. Click. Oh yeah, this is my last slide. We produced a video called Rethinking Methane. You'll find it on YouTube. It's 5 minutes, really easy to watch and easy to share. Next slide. I think that's it. That's it. My center, the CLEAR Center, is of course represented on the webpage clear.ucdavis.edu, and so please come in and see us there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thanks so much, Frank. Yeah, we'll go to Diana. Thanks, folks. Keep the questions coming. We might go a little bit over the hour because there's such great presentations here, but it's all being recorded as well. So keep the questions coming, the Q&A in the chat.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to let you know that I'm on day 4 of COVID, so I'm a little scratchy throated and might have to clear my throat a couple times. I am a registered dietitian and recently wrote a book and produced a documentary film, actually, that Frank is in, called Sacred Cow. And I've been very concerned about the vilification of meat, specifically red meat, as not only unhealthy, but also horrible for the environment and unethical. And so I produced this. I'm very pro animal source foods. I think they're incredibly important for human health. And I produced this just to have at least a balanced conversation when we're talking about how to feed the world moving forward, if we want to consider both human health and the environment. So this is just a quick overview of how Americans are spending their grocery dollar between 1982 and 2012. You can see that our spending on meat has actually gone down, but what's gone up by double is our spending on processed food and sweets. And between 1970 and 2017, our intake of meat has actually gone down in the US. Oops. I'm trying to move that, here we go. But we can see that we've got an increase in poultry, and that's largely due to inexpensive grain and antibiotic use. We've got an increase in grains, and that's not whole grains, that's in the form of ultra-processed foods, and then caloric sweeteners. Those are the big additions that we've had, in addition to processed oils, which are extremely inflammatory. And there's a big incentive for a lot of these companies to vilify meat because it actually takes the blame away from these ultra processed foods, which are what we call hyper palatable. They stimulate us to overconsume them. There's very smart people at these food companies making sure we can't eat just one. These are nutritionally poor foods. They make up about 60% of our diet here in the US. These are the foods that are the problem. It's not red meat. And I decided to go to walmart.com and just look up the price per pound of Beyond Meat compared to organic grass-fed beef, because a lot of people will say that organic grass-fed beef is elitist and unaccessible to people. I don't necessarily think everyone needs to be eating organic grass-fed beef, but I don't hear those same claims being made about Beyond Meat and the plant-based alternatives. And here you can see that When you look per pound, see, the Beyond Meat is actually sold in half-pound packages. But when you look at it, its price per pound, it's almost double the price of organic grass-fed beef. And then if you take the ingredients into account, look at all of those ingredients. And actually, Frank did a really, he's pretty funny on Twitter, and did a really great slide on Twitter showing dog food next to Beyond Meat, and the ingredients, you couldn't really tell the difference. So I highly recommend you follow Frank on Twitter. And then I just want to tell you, as a dietitian, if we take all the emotion out and just look at the nutrients in beef versus plant-based protein. So this is, I'm comparing kidney beans to sirloin steak, so 4 ounces of each. We need not only protein, but we need amino acids, and we need a very specific percentage of each one. Meat, just 4 ounces of meat actually hits our amino acid requirement almost entirely, or goes over. Whereas the protein in kidney beans, even though it says 9 grams, is actually quite low in some of the most important amino acids that we need in order for growth. Then when we look at the vitamins, and so meat is more than just protein, of course. We've got vitamins and minerals too. And as you can see, B12 is almost 100% at 4 ounces. And B12 and iron are 2 of the most common nutrient deficiencies worldwide. And those are, well, in the case of B12, only found in animal source foods. And in the case of iron, best found in animal source foods. And then when we look at minerals, you can also see that beef is winning. Zinc in particular is very protective against COVID and or against severe infection from COVID. Iron is also very important, and we're just seeing that meat wins, and it's not much more in calories, lots more protein, 0 carbs, and we know now that the fat from animal source foods is actually not the big villain. So animal source foods, when there's a plant source and an animal source of a nutrient, the body always prefers the animal source of that nutrient. And although Frank spent a lot of time talking about greenhouse gases, I just want to point out that the argument against meat, or for meat actually, is not just greenhouse gases, but unfortunately, this reductionist thinking is how these plant-sourced protein companies and processed food companies are winning. So we have to look at overall ecosystem function. So we need to be looking at the amount of pollinators that are in a landscape. We have to look at water. We have to look at wildlife. So all of these things are important, not just greenhouse gas emissions. And this is just an example of the difference between typical grazing, which is the continuous grazing, and managed grazing. So when the animals have constant access to the same chunk of land for the entire season, they're walking around, they're overgrazing their favorite patches, they're undergrazing other areas. It actually leads to more bare spots, more exposed areas, and that's really not the way that wild herds move. And so when we want to consider ecomimicry, what we want to do is actually break up those large pastures into smaller cells and then move those animals. And some of the ranchers that I visited when I was making my film move multiple times a day. So they might, open up a section of the electric fence in the morning and then actually move them again in the afternoon. And it really just depends on how quickly the grass is growing in that area, what the humidity is, what the herd numbers are. In the winter, they might move less, things like that. But what we see when we do this is that the land actually has a nice time to rest. And it's when the grass is resting that we actually see the best opportunity for carbon sequestration. We also see healthier animals because they're not overeating on someone else's potential parasite infested manure. The rainfall absorption is better, and we have much more diversity both above and below ground. So this is the type of grazing, mob grazing, managed grazing, adaptive, multi-paddock grazing. That's the type of grazing that Frank was referring to when he said well managed. And so again, it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions. When we look at a regenerative eco-mimicry type of system on the left, you can see when we have as much diversity as possible, it's a much healthier ecosystem overall. Extractive farming actually, annihilates all of the animals that are living in that area just to make the fields. Then you plow it, releasing all the carbon that was stored in the soil. And then, of course, you're destroying habitat for all of the wildlife that was there living before. You're making it impossible for insects and other wildlife to just live there because you're planting only one crop. So you don't have the wild bird populations. And this is interesting because even the Audubon Society is recognizing that regenerative farming is actually incredibly important for maintaining bird populations. And across the US, the biggest destroyer of bird populations has actually been monocrop farming. And so the Audubon Society is actually working with ranchers and has an Audubon certified beef that they're working with beef partners in order to bring back wild bird populations because these farms actually provide the habitat for that. Also, there's another common misperception that livestock take up too much land. And Frank does a beautiful job of explaining this in my film with his business card and folding some paper, but just explaining that most of the Earth's agricultural land cannot be cropped. And this is something a lot of people don't understand. But there's so many reasons why you might not be able to crop an area with wheat or corn or soy. The land might be too rocky, too steep, the soil's too poor. But what we can do is graze livestock on this area. And that's where most of the livestock currently is being grazed right now. And so if we removed livestock from our food production, we would actually be taking it largely off land that we wouldn't be able to crop anyway. So it would just actually end up leaving a hole in our food system. But even when cattle are finished on feedlots, and this is actually the global livestock average for all livestock, so including pigs and chickens, only about 13% of all livestock food is grain that actually competes with humans for food. Cattle are largely eating grass, other crop residues, byproducts. So for example, the corn stalks from the ethanol industry, the hulls from the pea protein industry, the soy cakes, things like that from the soybean oil industry. So what's so amazing about cattle in particular is that they can actually transform food that we can't eat, that has no other use in our food system, into protein, which is pretty incredible. And only 42% of the weight of the animal is actually eaten. So there's a lot of other benefits that we get from cattle, including insulin. Leather is actually, people think for some reason that, there's farms that just grow leather, and that if we stop using leather, maybe we'll be sparing some cow lives. That's absolutely not true. And in fact, the push for not using leather in cars, for example, has meant that a lot of the leather industry is actually just burying hides, which is such a waste. And so if we can be using all of the parts of this animal for other uses, it's only a benefit. The water use, I noticed when I was looking before at the chats that there was a question about water. And so I'm just going to briefly address this. My book, Sacred Cow, goes into this really deeply. But there's different ways of measuring water, and green water, which is the water that is found just in rain and the moisture that's already in grasses, that's the largest part of the water footprint for beef. So you can see that in typical beef that's finished on a feedlot, and I should add, it's usually only about 3 months that they're on a feedlot. So all cattle start on grass. They're either finished on grass or finished in a feedlot. 94% of the water footprint of typical beef is green water. and 97% in grass-fed beef is green water. So when we see these memes coming out from organizations like Meatless Mondays saying that, your quarter-pound burger took 10 bathtubs full of water to produce, it's actually quite inaccurate and misleading. So the blue water is lakes and streams. That's the water that the cattle are drinking. It is actually quite low compared to a lot of other common foods like avocados, walnuts, and sugar. And so there's a lot of investment coming in right now, a lot of excitement about plant-based burgers and lab meat. But when you really look at the energy inputs required for these fake meats, it makes no sense at all when you can just be capturing sunlight as the energy using photosynthesis on land we can't crop and turning that naturally into nutrient-dense food. These lab meat and veggie burgers are all relying on monocrop inputs. So pick a monocrop, corn or soy or wheat. And so it's extractive agriculture, it's destructive agriculture using a lot of fossil fuels, harvesting that and bringing it into a factory using high energy processes in order to turn that into a fake protein substitute that is not nutritionally superior to beef. Environmentally, as far as, when you're looking at overall ecosystem function, nowhere close to as good as well-managed beef. And I would argue ethically not as good either, because there's a lot of death that happens in that monocropping system. So here we've just got a very simple illustration. I do a lot of work for college students and high schoolers, but this is something that a lot of even grownups don't understand. And so I tried to make this very simple. We can get free energy from the sun, grow grass, and then convert that grass into nutrient-dense animal source foods while increasing biodiversity and sequestering carbon. So for more information, I'll just do a little shameless plug for the film Sacred Cow, which is available on Amazon or iTunes, or the book Sacred Cow, which is also on Amazon. And the book is much more detailed and cited and science-based. The film is much more stories of farmers and sort of big picture about ecological function. So thank you very much.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Diana. Thanks, Frank. Justin, you want to start us off with questions? You got one ready to go?
Yeah, I had a question for Diana. Ask maybe if you could talk a little bit more about diet recommendations from some of the comments in the chat and the Q&A. There seems to be maybe a perception that you recommend people eat mostly a carnivore diet. So if you could talk a little bit about diversity, and then also maybe connect that into kind of the functional ecosystem side of it. Like, that'd be cool.
Sure. I in no way recommend a meat-only diet. A lot of people really want to, it's really easy to break things into black and white, yes or no, all or nothing. And so just because I say that animal source foods are important for human health, it doesn't mean that I think you should only eat animal source foods and nothing else. I'm a firm believer in a whole foods diet that includes both animal source foods and plant-based foods that are in their most natural form. I think the big villain here is processed foods. And that is what we need to be focusing on as the big problem to human health.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that just a little bit, and because I think there's this you kind of mentioned it, this kind of reductionist way of thinking oftentimes where it feels like it's one or the other, and I feel like in some weird ways there seems to be this antagonism between kind of like, or you can imagine, between meat eaters and vegetarians. And I think that the thing that just strikes me so much reading your book, watching your movie, reading other books about nutrition or our agriculture system, is that there's so much common ground between people who approach this from a vegetarian standpoint or people who approach it from a meat eating standpoint. In terms of healthy diet and healthy for the planet, there's a lot of commonality there. We should be joining ranks to, because if there's one thing that the nutritionists around the world agree on, because there's lots of controversy about eating this versus that, and I think it's never as simple as one works for one person as works for another. But what everyone agrees on is processed foods are bad for you. I mean, there's just no doubt about that. There's no disagreement. So it feels to me like if we could kind of rechannel some of this energy about meat versus vegetarianism into the right ways of growing our food that include animals and plants, we'd be better off. And I know that that's going to be music to your ears, but I'd love it if you could just build on that a little bit, because that's such an important thing to get past this kind of conflict, unnecessary conflict I think we have.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the very first thing we say in the introduction of the film. Our narrator, Nick Offerman, actually says, are we arguing about the wrong thing? Because it's not plant versus meat. It actually is industrial farming versus a better way of farming. And so our entire food system needs to be assessed. But there's been, and I know Frank can talk about this a little bit more, a very extreme over-vilification of meat. And it's really unfortunate and I think unethical, because now we're having programs like Meatless Monday, taking meat off the plate of low-income children in city public schools, right? Based on zero evidence that taking meat away from growing children will actually result in better health outcomes. So while there are lots of pro-plant dietitians, and I am one of them, there are very few pro-meat dietitians. And so this project that I worked on is just to also vindicate meat, and not only vindicate it, but show that it actually can be a health food and something that can actually be one of our solutions to climate change.
Yeah, I think what's really important in this whole discussion, first of all, these food fights are highly unproductive. Okay, these food fights we all witness, and particularly witness on social media, highly unproductive. We have to acknowledge that the vast majority of people does enjoy, as a portion of their diet, some animal source foods. And that's not likely to change. I mean, we've seen some loud voices who suggest that we should go vegan, vegetarian, and so on, but the needle has not really moved in a major way. So if the vast majority of people wants to include animal source foods in their diets, then we have to think about how do we produce these animal source foods in the least environmentally harmful way, and also in ways that are best for animal welfare, producing safe food, food safety cannot be compromised and so forth. And I think we should all agree that what we need to do is we need to help our farmers to produce the best food that we know we can produce in a way that that is sustainable, and not just throw at farmers all of this criticism that they receive, and that really disgruntles them. Many farmers say, I have enough, I'm out of here. I don't want to pass this on to the next generation. And I tell you, this to me is really, really concerning. A real sustainability issue is the vast majority of farmers producing food in this country are now nearing retirement age, and they just about had it. They just about had it. We can work with them and achieve much better goals than just telling them what to do or telling people what to eat, which will never work.
I have a couple of things I'll add to that just to kind of address the question about how we move things forward. I think the way I said it earlier when I was talking, but one of the ways I think we move things forward is to the degree that we can, and particularly for those of us that have the means, we eat from perennial polycultures whenever we can, and then we shake hands with the person that produces our food. And I think that'll move things along at a much quicker pace. And it's my attempt, at least, at addressing several of the comments around that it's not a perfect system. There's a going back to the idea of eco-mimicry and looking at succession. What we're really trying to do is restore a degraded ecosystem, and that it doesn't happen overnight, and it takes input and time to make that successionary process happen. And whether you're eating meat or not, like if you're supporting people that are doing regenerative agriculture, I think it's really, really important. And one of their primary struggles, and I've talked to a bunch of farmers, and I ran into this a little bit when I was experimenting with my hobby farm, is it's a lot more expensive to raise this meat because you're not participating in a subsidized commodity market. And we need people that have an interest in moving things forward to support those farmers by purchasing from them, and then it'll help make these systems more commonplace.
And I think, Justin, I think you have we'll supply as a follow-up to this some ideas about how you can find those kind of farms that Justin's talking about. So we'll send that on. I wanted to get us back a little bit to the carbon sequestration question really quickly. And Frank, this is a question for you. So I loved your presentation. I love this idea of finding ways to reduce the amount of methane that cows produce so that the natural kind of destruction of methane in the atmosphere ends up, taking care of some of the accumulated methane and carbon in the atmosphere. So we've talked about kind of two things. One is reducing the amount of methane that cows produce, and another is changing the way we manage cows so that the soil actually sequesters more of the carbon. And I'd love it if perhaps you could talk a little bit about, is there a way of thinking about, obviously we need everything. We need both those things.
Yeah.
But can you talk a little bit about how those two things work together, or how we might think about the importance of each one of them?
Yeah, there are only two sectors in society that are not just sources, but also sinks for greenhouse gases, and that's forestry and agriculture. And so forestry and agriculture are so special because they can assimilate large quantities of atmospheric carbon and then sequester it in the soil, particularly if the soils remain undisturbed. And so this is, really the topic of your conference, of course. And farmers can really do a lot to improve soil carbon levels, soil organic carbon, through different management schemes, particularly in the ranching world. But even crop farmers can use minimum or no tillage and thus keep a lot of that carbon in the ground. That is not a this or that, it's a let's do this and that approach that I'm talking about. Let's reduce enteric methane. Let's help our ranchers to optimize, and farmers to optimize soil carbon capture. And those farms that are large, they will not just stop being large, and freestall dairies will not just stop being there because some people don't like them. So we have them there, and let's work on helping them improve, minimize their environmental performance too, because we will not just end up with a bunch of grazing farms in the United States. We'll also have the others. So to me, I have to be realistic enough to work with all sides and have them all achieve the best possible reduction of greenhouse gases on the one hand, and the best possible sequestration on the other. I think that within the next 5 to 10 years, we can reduce about half of all greenhouse gases from animal agriculture by using better methods on the grazing side, and by reducing enteric emissions, and by working on the manure side. I have seen that it's possible on the large scale. We are already making incredible strides here in California in systems where I never thought it would be possible, to that extent at least.
I think that's a great helpful note to go out on. Justin and Brian, do you?
I have one more thing I want to talk about, because or ask Diana about it, and Frank also, because I watching your movie, Diana, one of the things that really struck me was the kind of the commentary from some of the farmers who have moved to a more regenerative way of producing, and how it's helped their bottom line. And so I'd love to talk for both of you, maybe to comment just a bit on the potential of these things that we're talking about to not only help society, but help farmers to be more profitable and keep their farms in operation, and maybe be subjected a little bit less to the frustrations that they experience now. Can you comment on that?
Sure. There's certain areas in the country where it's a lot easier for farmers to shake hands with their consumers, and it's just not possible for all farmers to be able to do that. So here in the Northeast, We've got a lot of smaller scale farms, a very vibrant farmers market. And you know, when COVID started, all of my friends that produce meat were sold out for like 2 years of their meat. There's a very strong interest here, but I think that we also have to understand that for a lot of other farmers that are doing this at a really big scale, it doesn't always make sense for them to also market their food direct to consumers. And that there's still really good regenerative grazing that can happen before the animals are sent to a feedlot, and that feedlots aren't the worst thing in the world. The rancher, actually Alejandro Carrero from Chihuahua, Mexico, does amazing work on his ranch, you know, with regenerative grazing. He's healing the desert. Those cattle are sent to a feedlot because that works out better for him financially. And so it's not a black or white issue. It's there's great grazing that can happen before the cattle go to a feedlot. We've got some crop subsidies that make it really appetizing for feedlot finished cattle to happen, and it's also really efficient and fast. And also the feed conversion rate of a cow is it's really amazing. I mean, 2.5 pounds of grain per 1 pound of edible beef is, you know, as a dietitian, I would highly recommend you eat the beef and not the grain directly. But so I think we really just have to try to get away from commodity agriculture in general and more towards farmers actually selling direct, but that's just not going to be possible in every situation. And so I'm really on board with Frank, where we have to look for small wins on the bigger scale as well.
Hey, you know, in a country like the United States, people oftentimes think, and I saw some of that in the chat, that it's either the one or the other. You eat grass-fed or grain-fed. You eat organic or conventional or so. It's just not that way. I mean, all beef animals in the United States, all of them, spend at least 2/3 of their lives on pasture. And then a small minority of them stay on pasture for their entire life, and that's the grass-finished ones, whereas the majority go into a feedlot for the last 4 or so months of their lives. In the United States, we have 750,000 beef ranches, 750,000. Average size, 50 cows, okay? That is the base that we are dealing with here, 750,000 ranches. And then we have 1,400 feedlots. It seems like the criticism around the beef industry centers around the feedlots and not so much around the ranches. But I think all segments of the beef supply chain and all the other livestock supply chains have room to improve. And you know, some of these things we don't understand very well yet. For example, the sequestration rates, we know that there are certain farms that can do a great job with sequestration. And these sequestration rates have been enumerated. But by and large, this area is one of very active research, okay? And we need much more research in the area of how to improve sequestration. So it's not a black and white, and please don't see it that way, because it's not. And we have to help all farmers, regardless of on what side they stand, to do the best job they can, because this is our food. This is our food. We should not fight about it. We should promote it. We should enhance it. We should work with the farmers who help, who put it on our tables.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Frank, Diana, Justin. Thanks so much to Brian for being here. Thank you all for staying with us 10 minutes longer. I'll just put a link in the chat room to our remaining 2 Sequestration Week events on concrete tomorrow, and then soils will be similar on Friday. So I hope to see you there. Thanks for joining us. We'll send out a recorded video and the slides tomorrow, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.